Hello, my friends, and welcome. I'm so glad you've decided to join me tonight. Before we begin, I want you to take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights, find your most comfortable chair, and leave the busyness of the world behind. Tonight, we're stepping into the shadows to share a few stories that are as true as they are unsettling. So, take a deep breath, get cozy, and let's explore the dark together. Let me know where are you watching from and what time is in there. You're safe here. Before I share what happened to me, I want you to understand something. This is not fiction. This is not some campfire story meant to scare teenagers. What I am about to tell you actually happened to me during the 9 months. I worked the night shift at a Wendy's in suburban Pennsylvania. I have police reports, restraining orders, and medical records to prove every word of it. The reason I am sharing this now is because I recently learned that the man who terrorized me is being released from prison next month. And I want people to know what can happen when you ignore the warning signs. When you convince yourself that being polite is more important than being safe. So, here's my story. Every word of it is true. This all started 3 years ago when I was 22 years old, working my way through community college. I had taken a job at the Wendy's on Route 30 near my apartment because the pay was decent for fast food. And more importantly, the night shift meant I could attend my morning classes without conflict. The restaurant closed the dining room at 10 p.m., so after that it was just drive-through orders until 2 a.m. On most nights, there were only 2 of us working, one person taking orders at the window, and one person in the back cooking the food. It was quiet work usually. Boring even. The kind of job where you could zone out and let your mind wander while your hands moved through the familiar motions of assembling burgers and dropping fries into the oil. I knew all my co-workers fairly well since there were only about 8 of us on the night crew rotation. Most of them were decent people just trying to make ends meet. College students like me, single parents working a second job, older folks supplementing their retirement. We looked out for each other during those long, empty hours after midnight. All except for one person. His name was Marcus, and from the very first night I worked with him, I knew something was deeply wrong with the man. Marcus was in his early 30s, tall and rail-thin with greasy hair that hung in his face, and a way of staring at you that made your skin crawl. He never seemed to understand personal space. He would stand too close when talking to you, close enough that you could smell his sour breath and feel the heat radiating off his body. His hygiene was questionable at best. There were visible stains on his uniform that never seemed to get washed out, and his fingernails were always rimmed with black dirt. But what disturbed me most was the way he looked at women. Not just looked, but studied, examined. Like he was mentally cataloging every detail for some purpose I did not want to imagine. I was not the only woman who felt uncomfortable around Marcus. Every female employee at that Wendy's had stories about him. He would make comments about our bodies, about what we were wearing, about whether we had boyfriends. He would find excuses to brush past us in the narrow kitchen area, his hands lingering just a second too long if he had to reach around us for something. He would ask invasive questions about where we lived, what our schedules were, whether we lived alone. And he never, ever seemed to understand the word no. Marcus asked me out at least 20 times during those first few months. I declined every single time, trying to be polite at first, then increasingly firm as he refused to take the hint. I would tell him I was not interested, that I was focusing on school, that I had a boyfriend, even though I did not. Nothing worked. He would just smile this unsettling smile and say something like, "Maybe next time, or I can change your mind." Like it was all some game to him, and my refusal was just part of the challenge. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus started getting bolder. He would suggest we hook up in the walk-in cooler during our breaks. He would describe in graphic detail what he wanted to do to me, speaking low enough that the security cameras would not pick up the audio, but loud enough for me to hear every revolting word. He would stand in the doorway of the women's restroom, blocking my exit, asking me to reconsider his advances. Once, I came back from the bathroom to find him standing at my station, holding my phone, scrolling through my photos. When I demanded to know what he was doing, he just laughed and said he was curious about my life outside of work. I should have reported him right then. I know that now. But I was scared. Scared of how he would react if I got him in trouble. Scared that management would not believe me. Scared that they would blame me somehow, say I was overreacting, or that I had encouraged his attention. So, I stayed quiet and tried to avoid working the same shifts as Marcus whenever possible. But our manager was chronically short-staffed, and avoiding Marcus was not always an option. There were nights when it was just the two of us closing, and those nights were torture. He would spend the entire shift propositioning me, following me from station to station, standing so close behind me that I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. On those nights, I started carrying my keys between my fingers when I walked to my car, my pepper spray in my other hand. I would call my roommate as soon as I got in my car and stay on the phone with her until I was safely inside our apartment with the door locked and bolted behind me. Things changed dramatically about 6 months into my time at Wendy's. Marcus had always been creepy, but there was a night in late autumn when something in him seemed to snap. We were working together on a Saturday night, which meant it was busier than usual. I was handling the drive-through window, and Marcus was supposed to be cooking. Around 11:30 p.m., during a brief lull between customers, I noticed Marcus was not at his station. I called out for him, but got no response. I assumed he had gone to the bathroom or was in the manager's office doing some paperwork. Then I felt hands on my waist. I spun around to find Marcus standing directly behind me, so close our bodies were almost touching. His hands were on my hips, gripping tight, and he had this manic look in his eyes that I had never seen before. He leaned in, his lips nearly touching my ear, and whispered, "I'm tired of waiting. Tonight is the night you finally say yes to me." His breath was hot and smelled like stale coffee and cigarettes. I shoved him away with all my strength, sending him stumbling backward into the counter. The sound of a car pulling up to the drive-through speaker saved me. I turned back to the window with shaking hands and took the customer's order, my voice somehow managing to sound normal, despite the terror coursing through me. When I turned back around, Marcus was gone, back at his station like nothing had happened. But the rest of that shift, I could feel his eyes on me constantly. Every time I glanced his way, he was staring at me with that same disturbing intensity. When we closed up at 2 a.m., I waited until I saw Marcus get in his car and drive away before I would leave the building. I sat in the manager's office with the door locked for nearly 15 minutes, watching through the window to make sure his car did not return. The next week, strange things started happening. I would come home to find items moved in my apartment. Small things that my roommate insisted she had not touched. A picture frame turned to face the wall. My bedroom window open when I knew I had closed it before leaving. Clothes pulled out of my hamper and left on my bed. My roommate thought I was being paranoid, that I was just stressed from school and work. But I knew better. Someone had been in our apartment. Someone who had a key or knew how to pick a lock. Then there were the phone calls. My cell phone would ring at odd hours, usually between 2 and 4 a.m., right after my shift ended. When I answered, there would be silence on the other end. Not dead silence, but the kind where you can hear someone breathing, can sense their presence even through the phone line. This happened 4 or 5 nights in a row. I stopped answering calls from unknown numbers, but then the calls started coming to the restaurant. Our manager would tell me someone had called asking specifically for me, wanting to know my schedule, whether I was working that night. When she asked who was calling, they would hang up. I started documenting everything. I took photos of the disturbed items in my apartment. I saved the call logs from my phone. I wrote down every inappropriate comment Marcus made, Every time he touched me, every time I felt unsafe. I told my roommate everything, and she agreed to start keeping our apartment door chain locked at all times. We bought a cheap security camera and pointed it at our front door. I told a few coworkers what was happening, and they all had similar stories about Marcus. One woman said he had followed her home after work once. Another said she had found him sitting in his car outside her apartment building, just watching her windows. Things escalated again in early December. I came out to my car after a shift to find a note tucked under my windshield wiper. It was written in cramped, messy handwriting that I recognized immediately as Marcus's. The note said, "I know where you live. I know you are alone most nights. I know you think about me too. You just will not admit it yet. But you will. Soon." I stood there in the freezing parking lot, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold the note. I looked around, half expecting to see Marcus watching me from somewhere in the shadows, but the parking lot was empty. I took a photo of the note with my phone and then drove straight to the police station. It was 3 a.m, but I did not care. I needed to report this. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic, but explained that technically, Marcus had not made any direct threats in the note. He was creepy, yes. Disturbing, absolutely. But unless he explicitly threatened to harm me, there was not much they could do. They filed a report and told me to call 911 immediately if Marcus showed up at my home or if I felt I was in immediate danger. They also suggested I get a restraining order, but warned me that the process could take weeks and that Marcus would be notified, which might make him more aggressive. I drove home in a daze, the officer's words ringing in my ears. Technically not a threat. No immediate danger. I was furious and terrified in equal measure. The system that was supposed to protect me was telling me I had to wait until something worse happened before they could help. I had to wait until Marcus actually hurt me before anyone would take this seriously. The next day, I went to my manager and told her everything. Every comment, every inappropriate touch, every instance where Marcus had made me feel unsafe. I showed her the note. I showed her my phone logs with the unknown calls. I gave her the names of other employees who had complained about Marcus. She listened with a grave expression, nodding along, and then told me she would handle it. I felt a small measure of relief. Finally, someone in a position of authority was going to do something. Marcus was still on the schedule the following week. When I asked my manager about it, she said she had spoken with him and that he denied everything. She said it was his word against mine, and since there were no witnesses to most of the incidents, she could not fire him without more concrete evidence. She did agree to adjust our schedules so Marcus and I would not be alone together, but that was it. That was all the protection I was going to get. For a few weeks, the schedule adjustment seemed to help. Marcus and I barely crossed paths. When we did work the same shifts, there was always at least one other person there, usually one of the older male employees who had heard what was going on and made a point of staying close to me. I started to think that maybe the worst was over. Maybe Marcus had finally gotten the message and would leave me alone. I should have known better. On a Thursday night in late January, I arrived for my shift to discover there had been a scheduling mix-up. The third person who was supposed to work with us had called in sick, and no one was available to cover. It was going to be just me and Marcus for the entire night. I immediately called my manager, practically begging her to find someone else or to let me go home. She said she would try to reach someone, but could not make any promises. In the meantime, I needed to stay and work my shift. We were already operating with minimal staff. The first few hours were tense but uneventful. Marcus kept his distance, staying in the kitchen while I handled the drive-through window. We barely spoke except for the necessary communication about orders. I kept my phone in my pocket, finger hovering over the emergency call button. I told my roommate where I was and asked her to call me every hour to check in. Around midnight, the temperature outside dropped sharply, and a winter storm rolled in. The drive-through traffic slowed to almost nothing. By 12:30 a.m. we had not had a customer in over 20 minutes. I was wiping down the counter when I realized I was running low on ketchup packets and napkins at the front station. I would need to restock before we got another rush. The supplies were kept in the walk-in cooler in the back of the kitchen. I hesitated, knowing I would have to go past Marcus to get there. But we needed the supplies, and I could not leave my station bare. I took a deep breath, grabbed the tray we used for restocking, and headed toward the cooler. Marcus was at the grill when I walked past him. He looked up and watched me go by, but did not say anything. I pushed open the heavy cooler door and stepped inside, the blast of cold air making me shiver. The supplies I needed were on the far wall, stacked on metal shelving units. I was crouched down, loading napkins onto my tray, when I heard the unmistakable sound of the cooler door opening and then closing with a heavy metallic thud. I froze. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Slowly, I turned my head and saw Marcus standing between me and the door. His face had that same manic expression I had seen months ago, but worse now. More unhinged. More desperate. His eyes were wild, and there was a thin line of sweat on his upper lip despite the freezing temperature. "You should not have ignored me for so long," he said, his voice low and rough. "I have been patient. I have been nice. But you keep rejecting me. You keep acting like you are too good for me. Well, I am done waiting." He started moving toward me. I scrambled to my feet, the tray of napkins clattering to the floor. "Marcus, stop. I need you to leave right now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You need to get out of here." He shook his head slowly, a sick smile spreading across his face. "No, I do not think so. We are finally alone. No cameras in here. No one to interrupt us. Just you and me." That was when I noticed it. The camera in the corner of the cooler, the one that was always recording, had something covering its lens. A cardboard box had been positioned on the shelf in front of it, completely blocking its view. Marcus had planned this. He had covered the camera ahead of time. This was premeditated. Terror flooded through me. I looked around desperately for anything I could use as a weapon. There was nothing. Just shelves of food supplies and my own bare hands. Marcus lunged forward and grabbed my wrists, his grip bruising and painful. I screamed as loud as I could. "Help! Somebody help me! Get him off me! Help!" He tried to push me against the wall, and I fought back with everything I had. I kicked. I scratched. I bit. I managed to get one arm free and clawed at his face, my nails leaving deep red gouges across his cheek. He swore and his grip loosened just enough for me to wrench myself away. I ran for the door, my hand slipping on the cold metal handle. For one horrible moment, I thought he had locked it somehow, that I was trapped in there with him. But then the handle turned and the door swung open, and I burst out into the kitchen. There were customers at the drive-through window. I could see their car through the glass. I ran toward them, still screaming, my vision blurred with tears. The people in the car took one look at my face and started pulling out their phones. Within minutes, the parking lot was full of flashing red and blue lights. The police arrested Marcus that night. He tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, that he had just been trying to talk to me, and I had overreacted. But there were too many factors that contradicted his story. The covered camera in the cooler was the most damning evidence. When the police reviewed the security footage from the rest of the restaurant, they found several instances over the past few weeks where Marcus had been testing the other cameras too, moving boxes in front of them, adjusting their angles. He had been planning this for a long time. They also found dozens of photos of me on his phone. Pictures he had taken without my knowledge while I was working. Pictures taken outside my apartment building. Pictures of my car in various parking lots around town. He had been stalking me for months. It turned out I was not his first victim. When the police ran his background, they discovered Marcus had been arrested twice before in other states for similar incidents. Once in Ohio, once in Virginia. Both times he had been fired from restaurant jobs after sexually assaulting female coworkers. Both times the victims had chosen not to press charges, terrified of retaliation. Both times Marcus had simply moved to a new state and gotten a new job under a slightly different name, and the cycle had continued. This time, the charges stuck. Marcus was convicted of attempted sexual assault, stalking, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and tampering with evidence. The prosecutor used the covered cameras and the documented history of harassment to show premeditation. Marcus was sentenced to 8 years in state prison. I testified at his trial. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, standing up in that courtroom and recounting every terrible detail, while Marcus sat 20 feet away, staring at me with those cold, empty eyes. But I did it. For myself, and for all the other women he had victimized before me. I quit Wendy's the night it happened. I could not imagine going back there, could not walk into that cooler again without reliving those moments of pure terror. I transferred to a different community college in a different county, and moved apartments shortly after. I spent months in therapy, working through the trauma and the nightmares. My therapist told me I had PTSD, which did not surprise me. Even now, 3 years later, I still have trouble sleeping. I still check my locks 3 times before bed. I still feel a jolt of adrenaline every time I see someone who even vaguely resembles Marcus. The worst part is knowing that Marcus gets out next month. He served just under 6 years of his 8-year sentence, released early for good behavior. I have an alert set up that will notify me the day he is released. I know people like him do not just stop. I know there is a possibility he will come looking for me. So, I stay vigilant. I have moved twice since the assault. I use a different last name on social media. I carry pepper spray and a personal alarm everywhere I go. And I tell my story whenever I can, because I want other people to understand that workplace harassment is not just awkward or uncomfortable. It can escalate. It can become dangerous. It can become deadly. If you are reading this and thinking about your own workplace, about that coworker who makes you uncomfortable, or that boss who stands too close, please listen to me. Document everything. Tell people. Report it to management, to HR, to the police if necessary. Do not worry about being polite. Do not worry about overreacting. Your safety is more important than anyone's feelings. If I could go back, I would have reported Marcus the very first time he made an inappropriate comment. I would have made more noise, insisted on being taken seriously, refused to work with him. Maybe it would not have changed anything. But maybe it would have. The system failed me in a lot of ways. It failed the women Marcus victimized before me too. But I survived. I am still here. And I want you to know that if you are going through something similar, you are not alone. There are people who will believe you. There are resources that can help. You do not have to suffer in silence, and you do not have to wait until something worse happens before you take action. Trust your instincts. If someone makes you uncomfortable, there is usually a reason. If someone violates your boundaries, they will likely do it again and again until someone stops them. Do not wait for permission to protect yourself. Do not wait for proof. Your fear is valid. Your discomfort is valid. And you deserve to feel safe at your job, in your home, and in your life. Marcus will be released from prison in 32 days. I will be ready. I hope I never see him again. But if I do, this time I will not hesitate. This time I will not stay quiet. This time I will do whatever it takes to survive, because I already know what he is capable of, and I refuse to be his victim ever again. Before I share this account, you need to understand something about government negligence and witness intimidation. According to federal law under Title 18 United States Code Section 1512, witness tampering occurs when someone uses intimidation or corrupt persuasion to influence testimony. Between 2020 and 2023, police departments across the United States faced over 17,000 investigations into officer misconduct, including evidence tampering and fabricating false statements. The blue wall of silence, as researchers call it, protects officers who cover up failures, threatens those who speak out, and destroys careers of anyone who breaks the code. What I am about to tell you is not fiction. This happened in Cedar Falls, Pennsylvania, in January of this year. The victim's name was Ryan Mitchell. He was 29 years old. And the only reason anyone knows the truth is because one man refused to be silenced. I have replayed that night in my head thousands of times. My name is Daniel Torres. I am 34 years old and I work as a delivery driver for a regional courier service in Cedar Falls, Pennsylvania. I have been doing this job for 6 years now. It is honest work, mostly. You drive, you deliver packages, you go home. Nothing exciting. Nothing that prepares you to watch someone die while people with badges stand around doing nothing. It was January 16th, around 9:30 at night. Fog was rolling in thick that evening, the kind that makes your headlights almost useless. I was finishing my last route, heading down Industrial Park Road near the old construction site where they had been trying to build that new shopping complex. The project had stalled out months ago after the contractor went bankrupt. The whole area was just abandoned equipment, muddy lots, and this massive water-filled pit where they had been working on the foundation. I would not have stopped at all if I had not seen the car. It was a silver sedan halfway submerged in that pit, the back end sticking up at an angle. The headlights were still on underwater, casting this sickly green glow through the murky water. And on the roof, clinging to it with both hands, was a man. He was screaming. I pulled over immediately, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. The operator answered, and I told her everything. Car in the water, man trapped. Industrial Park Road near the construction site. She said units were being dispatched. She told me to stay on the line. The man on the roof saw me. He started waving one arm, the other still gripping the car. He was yelling something, but I could not make out the words over the distance. The car was maybe 40 feet from the edge of the pit. The water was dark, almost black in the fog, and I could see ripples around the vehicle. It was sinking. Slowly. But it was sinking. I am not a strong swimmer. I have never been. But I stood there at the edge of that pit, looking at that man, and I thought about going in. I really did. The operator was still talking, telling me emergency responders were on the way, telling me not to do anything dangerous. I could hear her voice, but all I could focus on was him. He looked so scared. Then his father arrived. An older man, probably in his 60s, pulled up in a pickup truck. He got out and ran to the edge of the pit, and the sound he made when he saw his son out there, it was not human. It was this raw, broken sound. He was shouting his son's name. Ryan Mitchell. The father was screaming it over and over, and Ryan was screaming back, telling him he was okay, that help was coming, that he just needed to hold on. But the car kept sinking. The first responders arrived at 9:54. I remember checking my phone. 24 minutes had passed since my call. The police came first. 3 patrol cars. Then the fire department. Then this disaster response team. I learned later they were called the Special Disaster Response Force, some kind of regional water rescue unit. I thought, okay, they are here now. They are going to save him. They did not even try. The officers got out of their cars and walked to the edge of the pit. They stood there with flashlights, shining them at Ryan, talking to each other. The fire department brought equipment, these long poles and ropes, but they just set them on the ground. Nobody was moving with any urgency. Nobody was getting into the water. Ryan was still screaming. His voice was getting hoarse. The water was up to the windows now. The car was tilting further down. Ryan's father was begging them. I watched this man, this grown man, get on his knees in the mud and beg the police to help his son. One of the officers, I found out later his name was Sergeant William Graves, told the father to calm down. Calm down. Like his son was not drowning 40 feet away. I walked up to them. I asked what they were waiting for. One of the younger officers, could not have been more than 25, told me they did not have the proper equipment. The water was too cold, too murky, too dangerous. I asked him if they were going to let that man die. He did not answer me. I stood there with Ryan's father and a dozen emergency responders, and we watched Ryan Mitchell hold onto that car roof for an hour and 47 minutes. I know the exact time because I was checking my phone constantly, trying to understand why nobody was doing anything. The water was up to his chest, then his shoulders, then his neck. He stopped screaming after a while. He just held on, quiet, and I think that was worse. The silence. At 11:18, I made a decision. I took off my jacket, my boots, and I jumped into that water. It was so cold it felt like knives. The kind of cold that makes your chest seize up and your brain scream at you to get out. But I started swimming. I could hear people yelling behind me, Ryan's father shouting my name, even though he did not know me, officers yelling at me to get back. I did not care. Someone had to try. The water was thick with sediment, construction runoff, oil, God knows what else. I could barely see a foot in front of me. I swam toward where I thought Ryan was, calling out to him. He did not respond. I kept swimming, kept searching. I was in that water for 32 minutes. I never found him. By the time I made it back to shore, so cold I could not feel my hands or feet, Ryan's father had collapsed. Emergency medical technicians were with him. The police were standing in a cluster, radios crackling, and the car was completely submerged. At 6:15 the next morning, they pulled Ryan Mitchell's body out of that pit. He had drowned. Cause of death: asphyxiation due to submersion. The medical examiner estimated time of death at approximately 11:45. That was 27 minutes after I jumped in. That was 2 hours and 16 minutes after emergency responders arrived on scene. The police held a press conference 2 days later. Sergeant Graves stood in front of cameras and said they had done everything they could. He said the conditions were too dangerous. He said they followed protocol. He said it was a tragedy, but sometimes these things happen. I watched that press conference, and I felt sick. 3 days after Ryan died, a reporter from the Cedar Falls Chronicle contacted me. Someone had given her my name. She wanted to know what I saw that night. So, I told her everything. I told her about the 24 minutes it took for responders to arrive. I told her about the hour and 47 minutes they stood there doing nothing. I told her about jumping in myself because nobody else would. The article went viral. By the next morning, it was on every news site in the state. People were furious. The Cedar Falls Police Department's social media pages were flooded with thousands of comments demanding answers. The mayor issued a statement. The governor announced a special investigation team would be formed to review the incident. 4 days after the article came out, I got a phone call from the Cedar Falls Police Department. They wanted me to come down to the station to give a formal statement. I thought, finally, they want the truth. I was wrong. When I arrived, Sergeant Graves and 2 other officers met me in an interrogation room. Not an interview room, an interrogation room. They closed the door. Graves sat across from me, and he did not look friendly anymore. He told me I had made some very serious accusations. He told me I had damaged the reputation of good officers who risked their lives every day. He told me the department had been receiving death threats because of me, because of what I said. I told him I only said what happened. He leaned forward and told me I was mistaken, that in the stress of the moment, I had misunderstood what I saw, that the officers on scene had acted quickly and professionally, that I needed to set the record straight. I asked him how I was mistaken about watching a man die for 2 hours, while nobody helped him. That was when his tone changed. He told me there was a prepared statement. He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was typed out, professional looking, and it praised the Cedar Falls Police Department's response time and professionalism. It said the officers had acted heroically under dangerous conditions. It said Ryan Mitchell's death was a tragic accident that could not have been prevented. It was a lie. Every single word. Graves told me I was going to read that statement on camera. He told me it would be distributed to the media. He told me it would correct the narrative. I told him no. The officer to my right, his name, Tag said, Officer Brennan, spoke up then. He told me I should think very carefully about my decision. He told me the department had been looking into me. Background checks. Financial records. They knew I had a history, he said. Some minor legal trouble when I was younger. Nothing serious. Just a possession charge from 10 years ago that got dismissed. But it could be brought back up, he said, if I continued to be uncooperative. I felt my stomach drop. This was not an interview. This was a threat. Graves stood up. He told me to go home and think about it. He told me they would contact me tomorrow for my recorded statement. He told me, and I will never forget this, that it would be in my best interest to disappear for a while after that. Lay low. Let things cool down. The media attention was dangerous, he said. People were angry. I might not be safe. I left that station shaking. The next day, they called again. I did not answer. They called 6 more times. On the 4th day, 2 officers showed up at my apartment. They did not arrest me. They just stood there in my doorway and told me this was my last chance. Read the statement or face the consequences. I read the statement. I sat in front of a camera at the police station, with Graves standing just out of frame, and I read the lies they had written for me. I said the officers had responded quickly. I said they had done everything they could. I said Ryan Mitchell's death was unavoidable. The video was released that afternoon. People called me a coward. They called me a sellout. Someone posted my address online. I started getting threatening messages. The police told me to stay off social media, to avoid public places, to keep my head down. They told me to go into hiding, for my own safety. A week later, the governor announced the special investigation team. The SIT was supposed to investigate the emergency response failure. They moved fast. Within 3 days, the municipal CEO of Cedar Falls was removed from his position. There was talk of charges being filed. The media was calling it a cover-up. But nobody from the SIT contacted me. I waited for a call, an email, anything. I was the key witness. I was the one who jumped in the water. I was the one who saw everything. But the investigation moved forward without me. I found out later, through a friend who works in the county clerk's office, that the Cedar Falls Police Department had filed a report claiming I was unreliable, that I had changed my story multiple times, that I had a criminal record, that I was seeking attention. They poisoned my credibility before the SIT could even talk to me. I tried to contact the SIT directly. I called their office 14 times. I sent emails. I drove to their headquarters and tried to speak to someone in person. Security turned me away. They said they would contact me if my testimony was needed. They never did. 3 months have passed now. The SIT released their preliminary findings last week. They determined that there were procedural failures in the emergency response. They recommended additional training for the Special Disaster Response Force. They suggested updating equipment protocols. But nobody was charged. Nobody was fired except the municipal CEO, who was barely involved. Sergeant Graves is still working. Officer Brennan is still working. The officers who stood at that pit and watched Ryan Mitchell drown are all still working. And I am still terrified. I live differently now. I do not answer unknown numbers. I check my car every morning before I start it. I installed security cameras at my apartment. I told my family what happened, the whole truth. And I made them promise that if anything happens to me, if I get arrested on some made-up charge, or if I disappear, or if I have a sudden accident, they should know it was not random. Ryan's father tried to contact me once about a month ago. He left a voicemail. He said he knew what they had done to me. He said he was sorry I got caught up in this. He said he wished he could fight them, but he did not have the strength. He sounded broken. I think about Ryan all the time. I think about those 2 hours. I think about how he died, alone in that freezing water, while people who swore to protect and serve stood on dry land and watched. I think about his father on his knees in the mud, begging for help that never came. And I think about what Sergeant Graves told me in that interrogation room, that I had damaged the reputation of good officers, that I should have kept my mouth shut. The truth is a dangerous thing when it makes powerful people look bad. I do not know what happens next. Maybe the SIT will eventually call me. Maybe they will reopen the investigation. Maybe someone will care that a man died preventable death, and the people responsible faced no consequences. Or maybe this is how it ends, with Ryan Mitchell dead, his father grieving, and me, the only witness willing to tell the truth, silenced by the same people who let him die. I am sharing this now because I need someone to know what really happened. Because if they come for me, if they find some way to discredit me completely or worse, I need there to be a record. A real record. Ryan Mitchell did not have to die. He begged for help. His father begged for help. I tried to help. But the people who could have saved him, who had the training and the equipment and the authority, chose not to. And when someone tried to tell the truth about it, they used every tool at their disposal to make sure that truth stayed buried. I am still looking over my shoulder. I am still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Because in Cedar Falls, Pennsylvania, the people who failed Ryan Mitchell are still in power. And the only crime they care about is mine. The crime of refusing to lie for them. Before I share this story, I need you to understand something. I have spent the last 6 months researching burial traditions and folklore from around the world, and what I am about to tell you sits at the intersection of documented tradition and unexplained phenomena. In certain cultures, there exists a belief that the deceased must be properly released from their burial shrouds exactly 40 days after interment, or the spirit becomes trapped between worlds. What happens when greed interferes with the sacred? This is based on a true account from Massachusetts, submitted to paranormal researchers in 2023. Names have been changed, but the events remain as they were reported. My name is Emma, and I am 24 years old. What happened to me last year has made me question everything I thought I knew about death, about greed, and about the things that walk in the spaces between our world and whatever comes next. I am sharing this because I need people to understand that some traditions exist for a reason, and some warnings should never be ignored. I grew up in a small town in rural Massachusetts, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the forests are so thick that even at noon, the canopy blocks out most of the sunlight. My mother raised me alone after my father left when I was 6. She worked 2 jobs, sacrificed everything, and never once complained. We were not wealthy, but we had each other, and that was enough. Or at least, I thought it was enough for her. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I had to attend religious education classes at the church on the other side of town. The only route there was a narrow dirt road that cut straight through Blackwood Forest, a dense stretch of old growth trees that seemed to swallow all light and sound. The path was maybe 2 miles long, but it felt like 10 when you were alone. No streetlights, no houses, just trees pressing in from both sides, their branches forming a tunnel overhead. The first few times I walked that path, my heart hammered in my chest with every step. Every crack of a branch made me jump. Every rustle in the underbrush made me walk faster. But after a few months, I grew used to it. I memorized every turn, every landmark. The split oak tree at the halfway point, the boulder shaped like a broken tooth near the 3/4 mark, the old stone bridge where the path crossed Miller Creek. I learned to recognize the sounds of the forest at night, the way the wind moved through the pines, the calls of owls hunting in the darkness, the distant howl of coyotes echoing from the ridgeline. I thought I knew that forest. I was wrong. It was a Thursday in late October, 3 weeks after my 23rd birthday. I had just finished my evening class and started the walk home. The temperature had dropped significantly since the afternoon, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the beam of my flashlight. The path was covered in fallen leaves that crunched under my boots with each step. Everything seemed normal at first. Then I heard it, a sound I had never heard before in all my months of walking this path. A heavy thump, like something large hitting the ground. I stopped walking immediately, holding my breath, listening. The forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just that oppressive, unnatural silence that makes your skin crawl. I aimed my flashlight toward the source of the sound, sweeping the beam across the trees. At first I saw nothing but shadows and tree trunks. Then something pale caught my eye, maybe 60 feet ahead, just at the edge of my flashlight's reach. I squinted, trying to make out what I was looking at. It was tall, maybe 6 feet, and appeared to be wrapped in something white. My first thought was that someone had hung a sheet between the trees as a prank. But the shape was wrong. It looked almost human. I stood frozen, my mind racing through possibilities. A person in a costume? Some kind of scarecrow? But who would put something like that in the middle of the forest, and why? Then it moved. Not walked, not shuffled. It jumped. One instant it was 60 feet away. The next instant it had covered maybe 40 feet in a single, impossible leap. Now I could see it more clearly in my flashlight beam, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. It was a body, or it had been a body, wrapped entirely in a white burial shroud that was tied at 3 points, one above the head, one at the neck, and one at the feet. The fabric was stained and dirty, and where the face should have been, I could see withered, gray-green skin stretched tight over bone. 2 deep, hollow eye sockets stared at me with infinite darkness. The mouth hung open in a silent scream, revealing blackened teeth. I could not move. I could not breathe. I could not think. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that this was not real, that this could not be happening. But there it was, standing impossibly still in the middle of the forest path, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, those empty eyes fixed directly on me. Then it jumped again. This time it closed the entire remaining distance in one leap, landing directly in front of me with a wet, heavy thud. I could smell it now, the sick sweet odor of decay mixed with earth and something else. Something chemical I could not identify. The shroud was bound so tightly that the thing could not walk properly. It should not have been able to move at all. But somehow, it had crossed 60 feet in 2 impossible leaps. I screamed. The sound seemed to break whatever paralysis had gripped me, and I turned and ran. I did not think about the path or the direction. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping across my face, roots trying to trip me with every step. Behind me I could hear it following. Not footsteps, but that same heavy thumping sound, getting closer with each impossible leap. I knew the forest well enough to know there was a narrow deer trail that cut through a particularly dense section of trees about 50 yards to my left. If I could reach it, if I could squeeze through, maybe this thing would not be able to follow. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all I had. I veered left, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as I ran, creating a chaotic strobe effect that made everything seem surreal and nightmarish. I found the trail entrance and threw myself into it, forcing my body through the tight gap between two massive oak trees. Thorns tore at my jacket. Low branches scraped my scalp. But I kept moving, crawling when I had to, running when I could. Finally, I emerged on the far side, right at the edge of my neighborhood. I risked a glance back, but I could not see anything in the darkness behind me. The thumping sound had stopped. I did not wait to see if it was still coming. I ran the remaining 3 blocks to my house and burst through the front door. My mother was in the living room, a half-empty glass of wine in her hand, her eyes glassy and unfocused. She had been drinking more lately, ever since she lost her job at the factory 3 months ago. When she saw my face, covered in scratches and dirt, my clothes torn, she actually smiled. It was not a smile of relief or concern. It was something else, something eager. "Did you see it?" she asked, leaning forward in her chair. "Did something follow you through the forest?" I stared at her, unable to comprehend the question. How did she know? I had not said anything yet. "Mom, something was chasing me. It was wrapped in white, like a burial shroud. It moved by jumping, and it was fast, impossibly fast. And I think it might have been." I could not finish the sentence. "Dead. I think it was dead." My mother's smile widened. She set down her wine glass and stood up, swaying slightly. "Was it tied at the head, neck, and feet?" "Yes," I whispered. "How do you know that?" "Emma, sweetheart, you need to listen to me very carefully." Her voice had taken on a strange manic quality. "What followed you is called a shroud walker. It is the spirit of someone who died and was buried in a ceremonial shroud. But the shroud was never properly untied after 40 days. The soul got trapped inside, bound to the physical world. Do you understand what I am telling you?" I shook my head. This was insane. My mother had never talked about anything like this before. "If you encounter a shroud walker," she continued, her eyes gleaming with an intensity I had never seen before, "and you are brave enough to embrace it, to hold it tight, and untie the knots that bind the shroud, you will be blessed with incredible wealth. The spirit will grant you riches beyond imagination as thanks for freeing it." "Are you out of your mind?" I shouted. That thing was chasing me. It was terrifying. I am not going anywhere near it. My mother grabbed my shoulders, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "Emma, we are broke. I have $16 in my bank account. The mortgage is 3 months overdue. The bank is going to foreclose next month. We need this. You need to do this for us." I pulled away from her, backing toward the stairs. "No, absolutely not. I do not care how much money it would supposedly give us. I am not touching that thing." Something hit the front door. A heavy, wet thump that shook the entire frame. My mother's eyes went wide, but not with fear. With excitement. "It followed you home," she breathed. "Emma, this is a sign. This is our chance." Another thump. Then another. Whatever was outside wanted in. My mother pushed past me and headed for the door. I tried to grab her arm to stop her, but she shook me off. She reached for the doorknob, and I screamed for her not to open it, but she ignored me. The door swung open. The shroud walker stood on our front porch, its hollow eyes fixed on me. In the porch light, I could see it even more clearly now. The shroud was not just stained, it was rotting, falling apart in places to reveal the decomposing flesh beneath. Patches of mold grew along the fabric. The smell was overwhelming, a physical wall of decay that made my stomach heave. My mother grabbed my arm and yanked me forward with surprising strength. "Do it for us, Emma. Do it for our family." Before I could resist, she shoved me toward the thing. I stumbled, my arms instinctively coming up to catch myself, and suddenly I was pressing against the shroud walker. The fabric was cold and damp beneath my hands. I could feel the inhuman shape beneath the shroud, all wrong angles and brittle bone. My mother's hands were on my back, pushing, forcing me to embrace this nightmare. "Hold it tight. Do not let go." I tried to push away, but the shroud walker's arms, such as they were, wrapped around me. The shroud shifted, and I felt something give way. My mother was pulling at the knots, working frantically to untie them. I wanted to scream, but I could not find my voice. All I could do was hold on as my mother freed the knots one by one. The final knot came loose, and the shroud fell away. The body beneath collapsed to the ground, nothing but bones and rotting tissue. The smell was indescribable. I staggered backward, gasping for air, my entire body shaking. My mother stood over the remains, breathing hard, her eyes wild. "We did it," she whispered. "We're going to be rich." Over the next 3 days, my mother's behavior became increasingly erratic. She stopped going to job interviews. She stopped leaving the house at all. Instead, she sat in the living room with a bottle of vodka, making elaborate plans for all the money we were supposedly going to receive. She had already written a list of things she wanted to buy. A new car, a vacation to Europe, designer clothes, jewelry. I tried to talk to her to make her see reason, but she would not listen. She was convinced that our fortune was coming any day now. She even stopped eating, subsisting entirely on alcohol and delusion. On the 4th day, she announced she was going out. It was nearly midnight, and she was already drunk, but she insisted she needed to drive to the bank to check if the money had been deposited yet. I begged her not to go. I offered to drive her. I offered to call her a cab. She laughed in my face and grabbed her car keys. I watched from the front window as she backed out of the driveway, the car weaving slightly even on our quiet street. I had a terrible feeling in my stomach, but I told myself she would be fine. The bank was only 2 miles away. She would check her account, see there was no magic deposit, and come home. 30 minutes later, my phone rang. It was the police. My mother had been driving on the wrong side of the road. Witnesses said she was going nearly 70 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. She ran a red light at the intersection of Main and Oak. A pickup truck hit her driver's side door at full speed. The police said she died on impact. Her blood alcohol level was 0.23, nearly 3 times the legal limit. I sat in the police station, numb, as they explained the accident to me. All I could think about was that smile on her face when she had pushed me toward the shroud walker. That manic gleam in her eyes when she talked about all the wealth we were going to receive. She had been so certain, so completely convinced that untying those knots would solve all our problems. The funeral was small. We did not have much money for anything elaborate. Just a simple service and a basic burial. I had no other family, so it was mostly neighbors and a few of my mother's former co-workers. As they lowered her casket into the ground, I thought about the shroud walker, about traditions and warnings, about the price of greed. 3 weeks later, I received a phone call from a lawyer I had never heard of. He explained that a distant relative of my mother's, someone I had never met, had passed away and left her entire estate to my mother as the last surviving member of that branch of the family. Since my mother was deceased, the inheritance passed to me as her sole heir. The amount was substantial. $347,000. Enough to pay off the mortgage, pay for my mother's funeral, and still have plenty left over for college and a new start. I stared at the paperwork, my hands shaking. The shroud walker had kept its promise. We had received wealth. But my mother was not alive to see it. She had died drunk and desperate, convinced the money was already on its way, too impatient to wait for it to actually arrive. I moved out of that house a month later. I could not stand to live there anymore, surrounded by memories of that night. The smell of decay seemed to linger in the front hallway no matter how many times I scrubbed the floor. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear a heavy thumping sound outside my bedroom door. But when I looked, nothing was there. I used some of the inheritance money to move to a city 3 hours away, somewhere with streetlights and crowds and no dark forests. I tried to start over, to put that night behind me. But I never forgot. A few months ago, I was walking past a cemetery on my way to work. It was an old cemetery, dating back to the 1700s, full of weathered headstones and elaborate monuments. Something caught my eye near the back of the grounds, behind a row of tall hedges. A figure wrapped in white, standing perfectly still between two old mausoleums. I stopped walking. My heart began to race. It could not be. Not here. Not in the city. The figure turned its head toward me. Even from 50 feet away, I could see those hollow eye sockets, that gray-green skin. It was tied at the head, neck, and feet. It jumped. Once. Twice. Closing the distance with impossible speed. I ran. I ran faster than I have ever run in my life. I did not look back. I did not stop until I was inside a crowded coffee shop, surrounded by people and noise and light. I do not know why it is following me. I do not know what it wants. Maybe the ritual was never properly completed. Maybe my mother's greed corrupted whatever pact we made that night. Maybe some doors, once open, can never be fully closed. I see it sometimes now. Always at a distance. Always watching. A pale figure wrapped in a rotting shroud, standing at the edge of parking lots, in the shadows of alleyways, behind trees in public parks. It never comes close enough for others to see it. Only I can. I am sharing this story because I want people to understand something important. There are traditions in this world that exist for a reason. Warnings passed down through generations are not just superstition. They are lessons written in blood and loss. When folklore tells you not to disturb the dead, when it warns you that some gifts come with terrible prices, when it says that greed will destroy you, you should listen. My mother wanted wealth. She got it. But she was not alive to spend a single dollar of it. The shroud walker kept its promise, but the timing was its own. And now I carry the weight of that night. The memory of holding death in my arms while my mother worked frantically to untie knots that should have been left alone. I still have nightmares about the smell, about the feeling of cold, rotting flesh beneath my hands, about my mother's manic smile as she pushed me towards something no living person should ever touch. And I wonder, late at night when I hear that heavy thumping sound outside my apartment, if the shroud walker is waiting for me to complete whatever bargain my mother made. If one day I will open my door and find it standing there, patient and eternal, ready to collect whatever debt remains unpaid. I moved to the city to escape the forest. But some things follow you no matter how far you run. Some things are bound to you by knots you cannot see, tied in moments of desperation and greed. And once those knots are made, I am beginning to think they can never truly be undone. If you ever find yourself walking alone at night, and you see something pale watching you from the shadows, something wrapped in white and tied at 3 points, do not approach it. Do not listen to anyone who tells you it will bring you wealth or good fortune. Run. Run as fast as you can and do not look back. Because some prices are too high to pay, even if you do not realize it until the bill comes due. And it always comes due. Always. There's a concept in parapsychology called psychometry, also known as soul reading. The theory suggests that objects, especially jewelry worn directly against the skin for years, can absorb and retain the energy of their previous owners. In 1842, American professor Joseph Rhodes Buchanan coined this term after conducting experiments showing that certain individuals could sense the history of objects through touch alone. Whether you believe in this or not is up to you, but what happened to the woman in tonight's story might make you reconsider ever buying secondhand jewelry again. This account was submitted anonymously to multiple paranormal forums, and I have verified similar cases from antique dealers in Louisiana, Pennsylvania, and collectors across the United States who have experienced nearly identical phenomena. What you are about to hear is her testimony. This is a story about someone named Claire, a 32-year-old woman who loved vintage accessories. Claire thought of herself as just a collector, someone who appreciated the history and craftsmanship of old things. But little did she know that one innocent purchase would drag her into a chilling experience, one she could have never seen coming. Claire, now living in Portland, Oregon, used to adore secondhand treasures. Before all this happened, wandering through estate sales and vintage shops was like therapy to her. She loved running her fingers over old worn trinkets and wondering, who did this belong to? What kind of life did they live? You know how some people get fascinated by old buildings and antiques because they seem to whisper stories about the past. And yeah, that was totally Claire. She felt like second-hand goods were little storytellers from another time. Among all those vintage finds, her favorite kind was metal jewelry, rings, bracelets, necklaces, anything like that. And she always thought there was something special about pieces that had been worn directly on someone's skin for years. Like they carried untold memories and secrets within them. What Claire did not know was that in parapsychology circles, this belief has a name: psychometry, the measuring of souls through objects. And then one ordinary day, while browsing through an online marketplace like she always did, she stumbled upon this peculiar silver bracelet. It had a thin, delicate chain, but what caught her eye were the strange, intricate engravings covering every inch of it. Tiny symbols and patterns, almost like someone had carved them by hand with obsessive precision. It was obvious that the bracelet was old, maybe even too old, Victorian era at least. But that only made it more irresistible to her. And the best part, it was really cheap, only $35. The listing was sparse. No history, no provenance, just a grainy photograph and a seller with zero feedback. Most collectors would have passed, but Claire could not resist. Without a second thought, she clicked that Buy Now button. A few days later, she heard the familiar knock at her door. The parcel had arrived. Finally, it is here. She was so excited, so she tore open the box. But tucked inside was not just the bracelet. There was also a handwritten note from the seller, and it was a little off. It said, "Handle with care." That is all it said. Not something like, "Hope you enjoy it," "We're so glad it found a new home," which is what you would usually expect. No, it sounded more like a warning. But Claire just shrugged it off. It is probably old and fragile. They must just mean do not break it. And with that, she moved on, completely unaware of the nightmare that was about to begin. So, of course, Claire tried on the bracelet right away. The cold touch of the metal against her wrist was strangely pleasant, almost mysterious. The delicate patterns engraved all along the chain. They looked like someone had painstakingly carved them by hand. There was something personal about it, almost intimate. She could not help but think, what a steal. I got lucky with this one. Standing in front of the mirror, she admired it a little more. The bracelet fit her wrist so perfectly, like it was made just for her. Not a millimeter too loose or too tight. It was flawless. But after that day, weird things started happening. At first, it was just a feeling. Inside her home, she would get these random chills crawling up her spine. Even while watching television, it felt like someone was standing behind her, quietly staring. She would catch herself glancing over her shoulder more and more, even when she was sure no one was there. And then, there were the mirrors. Every now and then, she would swear that she saw something, a faint dark shadow brushing past behind her reflection. Each time her body would tense up, but she would try to brush it off. Probably I am just tired. That is all she told herself. She was busy after all. Work, errands, life. Maybe she was just overworked. But the strange occurrences only got worse. The feelings were not just vague anymore. They were sharp, undeniable. And one evening, while washing her face, she casually lifted her head and froze. Behind her, in the mirror's reflection, there was a dark figure. A woman's silhouette, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothing, a long dress with a high collar. Panicked, Claire let out a scream and stumbled backward, falling to the floor. When she finally gathered herself and looked again, it was gone. From that point on, she could not shake the growing sense of unease. It was no longer something she could ignore. And then just a few days later, something happened that she could not rationalize away. Late one night, after dragging herself home from a long shift at the architectural firm where she worked, she collapsed into bed. The next morning, as she was about to leave for work, she noticed something strange. One of her shoes, the pair she always left by the front door, was missing. She searched every corner of the apartment, half convinced she must have absent-mindedly left it somewhere. But no matter how hard she looked, it was nowhere to be found. And honestly, who leaves a shoe in the bathroom or in the kitchen? Reluctantly, she grabbed another pair from the shoe rack and left for work. She did not think much more of it until she came home that evening. The moment she stepped inside, her heart dropped. There it was, the missing shoe sitting perfectly in the middle of her front entryway, placed toe-to-toe with its partner as if it had never left. Claire said she just froze. She could not move. The shoe she had turned the apartment upside down for that morning was now calmly waiting for her as if it had never left. Thing is, Claire's apartment was not the kind of place someone could just wander into. The door, the windows, were all secured, properly fitted with locks and a security chain. Nobody could have snuck in, even if they tried. Still, just to be sure, she asked the building management to check the security camera footage from outside her door. But nothing. Not a single sign of anyone coming or going. So, she began to wonder, am I just really burnt out? Am I just so tired that I am imagining things? After all, when you are tired enough, even shadows start to play tricks on you, right? But from that night on, sleep did not come easy anymore. Just as she was about to drift off, she would hear it. A low, muffled murmuring coming from the wall beside her bed. At first, she assumed it was just thin walls and noisy neighbors. Happens all the time, right? But then it hit her. No one lived next door. Both units beside hers were vacant. The landlord had confirmed it just 2 weeks prior. And yet the sounds continued. Not just muffled voices, but chatter like a group of people, women whispering and murmuring together in hushed tones. She could not make out the words. They were all garbled like underwater echoes. But there was definitely something. What sent chills down her spine was that the voices, they seemed to get closer. At first it sounded like they were coming from far beyond the walls, maybe from the empty apartments. But slowly, night after night, it felt like they were inside the room, like right in the middle of it, circling her bed. Claire did what most of us would do. pulled the blanket over her head and held her breath, trying not to make a sound. But the whispers, they never stopped. They would go on for hours before finally fading around 4 or 5 in the morning, leaving her sleepless and terrified. Exhausted and desperate, she finally went to the hospital. The psychiatrist told her it was just stress, prescribed some medication for anxiety and insomnia, and sent her on her way. And for a few days it actually seemed to help. The whispers faded slightly, became less frequent, but before long, they returned. Louder, closer, even more persistent. Even after getting stronger medication, nothing changed. And then after about a month of this hell, something happened. One morning, as she was putting on her makeup, getting ready for work, her eyes landed on her wrist. That silver bracelet was still there, but now there were faint reddish marks around it. Marks that looked eerie, like fingerprints. Small, delicate finger-shaped impressions pressed into her skin. Her first instinct was to think maybe she had grabbed her own wrist in her sleep, but deep enough to leave clear finger-shaped marks? She was not convinced. And that is when the bracelet started to feel wrong, like it was not just an accessory anymore. So without hesitating, she took it off and set it aside in her jewelry box before heading out for work. But that very day, Claire got into a car accident. She was driving to the office when out of nowhere, another car slammed into her at an intersection. And here is the unsettling part. The driver who hit her. They told the police they had no memory of the moment, as if they had just blacked out right before impact. Claire ended up hospitalized for a few days with a concussion and bruised ribs. But the nightmares, they followed her to the hospital. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them. Women in old-fashioned clothing, Victorian-era dresses with high collars and long sleeves. A woman with no face, just smooth skin where features should be. Figures with missing hands, stumps wrapped in yellowed bandages. All kinds of twisted spirits haunted her dreams. Unable to sleep, drowning in insomnia even in the hospital, she finally tried searching online for anyone with similar symptoms on her phone. And again that word came up. Psychometry. The ability some people have to read the energy of objects, to feel the residual emotions left behind by previous owners. At first, Claire scoffed at the idea. Psychometry. Soul reading. It sounded ridiculous. But as her symptoms worsened, as the sleepless nights piled up and the hospital visits became routine, she found herself getting desperate. She started digging deeper online, hoping, maybe even needing to find something that could explain what was happening to her. And that is when she stumbled upon something. A forum post almost hidden among the search results from a paranormal investigation group in New Orleans. It said that anyone experiencing these kinds of symptoms after acquiring antique jewelry should seek consultation from someone experienced in object cleansing. The poster mentioned a specific case from Louisiana, where an antique dealer named Maria Roberts had purchased a Victorian ring at an estate sale, only to experience overwhelming waves of sadness and visions of a weeping Victorian woman every single time she touched it. The post went on to describe how some antique dealers and collectors have reported similar experiences, particularly with jewelry from the Victorian era. During that time period, mourning jewelry was common, pieces made from the hair of deceased loved ones, lockets containing photographs of the dead, rings engraved with death dates. These items were worn during extended periods of grief, sometimes for years, absorbing profound sorrow and loss. Claire read further. The forum mentioned that a collector in Pennsylvania had purchased a pair of antique hat pins, and immediately felt a burning sensation when she held them, so intense that she had to put them down. Another woman reported buying a Victorian bangle bracelet online, and the very first night she brought it home, she had vivid nightmares about a young girl. The nightmares repeated every single night until she had the piece cleansed. Under normal circumstances, Claire would have clicked away immediately. Not her thing. But when you are face to face with a kind of fear you never thought you would encounter in real life, you start to reconsider. So, without telling anyone, she decided to reach out. The forum poster responded within hours and gave her the contact information for a spiritual consultant in Seattle, just 2 hours north of Portland. The consultant specialized in what they called residual energy removal from objects. A few days later, freshly discharged from the hospital, Claire found herself standing in front of a small house in a quiet Seattle suburb. The second she stepped inside, an unsettling chill greeted her, but it was different from what she felt at home. This felt controlled, purposeful. The consultant, an older woman named Eleanor who introduced herself as a psychometrist and energy worker, did not waste time with pleasantries. As soon as Eleanor laid eyes on Claire, she asked almost casually, "You have bought something recently, have you not?" "Something old, something worn against skin." At first, Claire shook her head. Nothing came to mind. But then, yeah, the bracelet. So, she told Eleanor that she bought a bracelet online, and Eleanor's face hardened. This person said, "Describe it to me." Claire described the silver chain, the intricate engravings, the perfect fit. And Eleanor nodded slowly, as if she had heard this exact story before. "That is psychometry at work," Eleanor explained. Some objects, especially jewelry worn for long periods, can retain what we call energetic imprints. When someone experiences intense emotion while wearing a piece, fear, grief, rage, despair, that energy can become embedded in the metal itself. Eleanor went on to explain that the bracelet had likely belonged to someone who suffered greatly, and when Claire put it on, she opened herself up as a conduit for that residual energy. The spirits Claire was seeing were not necessarily ghosts in the traditional sense, but rather echoes, impressions of suffering so strong that they manifested visually to those sensitive enough to perceive them. Eleanor then said something that made Claire's blood run cold. If you had waited even a little longer, if you had kept wearing it, the energy would have bonded with you permanently. You would have started experiencing their emotions as your own. Eventually, you would not have been able to tell where you ended and they began. Hearing those words, all the tension Claire had been carrying seemed to crash down on her at once. Eleanor instructed her to bring the bracelet immediately. Without a second thought, Claire nodded and rushed back to Portland. But when she got home, something else sent a chill racing down her spine. The bracelet, which she swore she left locked in her jewelry box on the dresser, was now neatly placed on her bedside table, right next to where she slept, and the jewelry box was still locked. Frozen with fear, she could only stare. She knew then she could not delay any longer, no matter what. Heart-pounding, she grabbed the bracelet without touching it directly, using a tissue, and stuffed it into a Ziploc bag, then into her purse. She told herself that tomorrow at dawn, no matter what it took, she would call in sick, skip work, whatever, and drive straight back to Seattle. But that night, something felt off from the very start. The lights inside her apartment began flickering. At first, it was subtle, like a power surge. But then the living room light started flashing wildly, turning on and off like something was playing with the switch. Thinking it might just be a faulty bulb, Claire cautiously approached to check. That is when she heard something, a soft but chilling giggle echoing from the end of the hallway leading to her bedroom. She had heard strange sounds before, sure, but this time the laughter was clearer, sharper, almost playful, and it lingered far too long. She was terrified. She forced herself to ignore it and return to her couch. But just as she sat down, she heard another noise, a metallic clink coming from her purse on the kitchen counter. It was faint but distinct, like the bracelet had moved on its own inside the bag. Claire told herself it was just her imagination, but deep down she knew something was not right. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time she cracked her eyes open, She saw the shadows of figures circling her living room slowly, deliberately. Worse yet, hovering near the ceiling were the same spirits she had seen in her nightmares back at the hospital. The woman without a face, figures missing their hands, drifting unnaturally above her, all staring down as if watching, waiting. It is just a hallucination. It is all in my head, she kept whispering to herself, gripping the blanket tightly. Her heart pounded, but she swore to herself, tomorrow, I will take the bracelet to Eleanor. The next morning, with dark circles under her eyes and trembling hands, she set out for Seattle, determined to get rid of the bracelet once and for all. But halfway there, her car began to rattle uncontrollably on Interstate 5. Panicked, she pulled over to the side of the highway. A sharp metallic screech rang from the engine. But when she got out to check, nothing seemed wrong. The engine started back up like nothing happened. But when she glanced at the rearview mirror before pulling back onto the highway, a mass of long black hair was visible in the back seat, draped over the headrest. Her blood ran cold. Without turning her head, she clung to the steering wheel and mumbled prayers under her breath. God, please, anyone, just help me get there safely. And she forced herself to keep driving, eyes locked on the road ahead. And then, as if that was not enough, a few miles down the road, she saw them. A small group of women standing still right in the middle of the highway shoulder, just off the white line. They were wearing old faded dresses, long skirts and high collars, Victorian clothing, staring straight at her, faces blank, unmoving. There were no other cars around, no witnesses, just her and them. She swerved quickly back into traffic, gripping the wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. And finally, after what felt like hours for a drive that should have taken only 2, she arrived at Eleanor's house. The sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. When she knocked, Eleanor burst out the door. You made it. Good. You did well. Already knowing somehow that the journey had been anything but smooth. Claire reached for her purse to hand over the bracelet. But the zipper would not budge. It felt like something was pulling it shut from inside. Using all her strength, she finally yanked it open, accidentally flinging the purse to the ground, and its contents spilled everywhere across Eleanor's porch. And among them, there it was, the silver bracelet, still sealed in the Ziploc bag. As it rolled across the wooden porch, the sound it made was unlike anything she had heard before. Not just metal clinking, but sharp, piercing, almost like a scream disguised as a sound. Claire knew this was not just an old bracelet anymore. Eleanor wasted no time. Grabbing the bag with gloved hands, this person immediately brought Claire inside and started preparing. Sage bundles, salt circles, small bowls of water, all laid out in a practiced rhythm on a table covered with a white cloth. And then, as if on cue, the noises began. Claire heard countless whispers gathering just beyond the front door, murmuring, scratching. Eleanor told her, ignore whatever you hear. Never look toward the door. Just close your eyes and stay inside the salt circle I have drawn. Eleanor's chanting grew louder, faster, almost like a battle cry in a language Claire did not recognize. Eleanor opened the Ziploc bag carefully and placed the bracelet directly over the burning sage. In seconds, thick, suffocating smoke filled the room, and the smell was overwhelming. Not just sage, but something else, something rotten underneath. And then came the screams, ear-splitting, gut-wrenching screams from outside. Multiple voices, women's voices, screaming in unison. Claire sat frozen inside the salt circle. But in that moment, it all came rushing back. The nightmare spirits from the hospital, the faceless woman, the ones floating and watching from the corners of her room, flashing through her mind like a cursed film reel. The screams outside the door grew wilder, angrier, more desperate. Shadows began writhing against the frosted glass window like they were pounding, clawing to get inside. Eleanor did not even flinch. Eleanor kept chanting, kept feeding more sage to the flames, the bracelet sitting in the center of the smoke. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the sage burned down to ash. The screams faded to silence. The shadows stopped moving, and the room grew still. Claire looked at the bracelet. The once shimmering silver had turned completely black, tarnished and charred, the intricate engravings barely visible anymore. "It is done," Eleanor finally said, her voice hoarse from chanting. Then, without missing a beat, Eleanor added, "If you had waited even one more week, you would have been completely lost. The energy would have fused with yours. You would have become a vessel for their suffering. But you had just enough clarity left to find help." Hearing those words, all the tension Claire had been carrying seemed to crash down on her at once. Her legs gave out, and she sank helplessly to the floor, sobbing. Eleanor knelt beside her and said quietly, "The bracelet will be buried tonight in consecrated ground. You must never speak of this to anyone who would not believe you. And you must never, ever purchase second-hand jewelry again without having it cleansed first." Since that day, Claire has never touched another vintage item. No estate sale finds, no online marketplace treasures, nothing. And the spirits, the whispers, the shadows, she has never seen them again. But still, when you think about it, what exactly did Claire experience? Was it psychometry, the residual energy of a tormented soul imprinted onto silver? Or was it something darker, something that should have stayed buried with its original owner? And what other stories could be hidden behind those vintage treasures, quietly waiting in online marketplaces and antique shops for their next owner? Researchers in parapsychology have documented hundreds of similar cases. Antique dealers across the country report experiences like Maria Roberts in Louisiana, who sold a Victorian ring after feeling overwhelming grief every time she touched it. Collectors in Pennsylvania describe burning sensations from estate sale purchases. Online forums are filled with accounts of people who bought vintage jewelry and experienced immediate personality changes, nightmares, or unexplained phenomena. The concept of psychometry suggests that objects, especially those worn intimately against the skin, can absorb the emotional energy of their owners. And if that is true, then every piece of vintage jewelry carries with it not just a history, but potentially the suffering, the rage, the despair of everyone who wore it before. So the next time you see that beautiful antique bracelet online, listed cheap with no history and a cryptic note from the seller, maybe you should ask yourself, why are they so eager to get rid of it? And what are they not telling you? Because sometimes the past does not stay buried. Sometimes it comes home with you, wrapped in tissue paper, waiting patiently in a small cardboard box. And by the time you realize what you have brought into your home, it might already be too late. Before I tell you what happened to me in the Arkansas Ozarks 3 months ago, I need you to understand something about my background. I am a wildlife biologist with the Missouri Department of Conservation. I have spent 15 years studying black bears, cougars, and other large predators across the Midwest. I have tracked animals through some of the most remote wilderness areas in North America. I have encountered grizzlies in Montana, moose in Alaska, and wolves in Minnesota. I know what bears look like, how they move, how they smell. I have seen black bears that weigh over 400 pounds. I have watched them climb trees, forage for food, and defend their territory. What I saw on that October afternoon in the Boston Mountains was not a bear. It was not anything I've ever seen in 15 years of field research. It was not anything that should exist. I had been planning a solo backpacking trip into the Ozark National Forest for months. The purpose was simple: test new lightweight camping gear before winter, get some distance from civilization, and clear my head after a brutal divorce. I chose a remote section of the Boston Mountains in northern Arkansas, about 30 miles south of the Missouri border. The area is heavily forested, rugged terrain with steep ridges and deep hollows that most hikers avoid. Perfect for solitude. I parked at a trailhead off Highway 74 on a Friday morning in mid-October. The weather was ideal, crisp and cool, around 50 degrees, with clear skies predicted for the entire weekend. I packed light, a new ultralight tent, a down sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees, a compact stove, freeze-dried meals, water filtration system, and my rifle. I always carry a rifle when I am alone in the backcountry, a Ruger American in .308 caliber. It is not for hunting, it is for protection. Black bears are generally docile, but I have had enough close encounters to know that being prepared is not paranoia. It is common sense. The trail started easy, a gradual incline through oak and hickory forest, the kind of terrain I have hiked hundreds of times. I made good time, covering about 6 miles in 3 hours before the trail petered out into unmarked wilderness. I was aiming for a spot I had identified on topographic maps, a small clearing near a seasonal creek, about 8 miles from the trailhead. Remote enough that I would not see another soul all weekend. Around 2 in the afternoon, I stopped to refill my water bottles at the creek. The forest was quiet, just the sound of water moving over rocks and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I knelt down, activated my water filter, and that is when I smelled it. The first thing that hit me was the odor. It was not the musky scent of a bear or the sharp tang of deer urine. It was something else entirely. A thick, rotten stench that reminded me of roadkill left in the sun for days, mixed with wet fur and something almost sulfuric. I stood up slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. Then I heard it. A low, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, more like the deep hum of an engine idling. It was coming from uphill, maybe 50 yards away. Somewhere in the dense undergrowth between the ridge and the creek. I unslung my rifle and clicked off the safety. My heart was pounding, but my training kicked in. Make yourself big, make noise, back away slowly. I raised my arms and shouted, "Hey bear, go on, get out of here." The rumbling stopped. Silence. Then I heard branches breaking, heavy footsteps moving through the brush. Whatever it was large, very large, and it was coming toward me. It emerged from the trees about 30 yards away, and for a moment my brain refused to process what I was seeing. It was massive, easily the size of a full-grown black bear, maybe 7 feet long and 4 feet tall at the shoulder. But the proportions were all wrong. Its body was thick and barrel-shaped, covered in matted dark brown fur that hung in thick clumps like dreadlocks. The fur looked almost armored, caked with mud and debris, forming thick plates across its back and sides. Its head was the most disturbing part. It was too large for its body, almost grotesquely oversized, with a short, blunt muzzle and small, sunken eyes that looked almost intelligent. The ears were tiny, barely visible beneath the matted fur. Its legs were short and thick, built like tree trunks, ending in massive paws with long curved claws that dug into the forest floor with each step. It moved slowly, almost lumbering, its head swaying side to side as it walked. I stood perfectly still, rifle raised, finger on the trigger. The creature stopped about 20 feet away and stared at me. Its eyes were dark, almost black, with no visible whites. It tilted its head, studying me with what I can only describe as curiosity. Then it opened its mouth. The teeth were blunt and yellowed, more like a herbivore than a predator. But there were too many of them, rows upon rows packed into its massive jaws. It made that rumbling sound again, louder this time, vibrating through my chest like standing next to a subwoofer. Then it took a step forward. I fired. The rifle shot echoed through the forest, and I saw the bullet hit the creature square in the chest. The impact was visible, a small cloud of dust and debris exploding from its matted fur. The creature flinched, took a step back, and shook its head like a dog shaking off water. Then it looked at me again, and it took another step forward. I fired again, aiming for the head this time. The bullet struck just above its left eye, and again I saw the impact, but the creature barely reacted. Its fur seemed to absorb the force, the thick, matted layers acting like natural body armor. I realized with cold certainty that my rifle was not going to stop this thing. I had two options: run or pray it lost interest. The creature did not charge. It just stood there, watching me with those small, dark eyes, breathing heavily through its nose. I could see its chest rising and falling, each breath producing a low wheeze that sounded almost mechanical. It shifted its weight from one leg to another, and I noticed something strange. It was slow. Not just cautious, but genuinely slow. Its movements were deliberate, almost ponderous, like it was thinking carefully about each step. I took a slow step backward. The creature tilted its head, but did not follow. I took another step. Still nothing. Then it did something that froze me in place. It sat down, just lowered itself onto its haunches like a dog, and continued staring at me. Its tongue lolled out of its mouth, thick and gray, and it made a sound that I can only describe as a low groan, almost plaintive. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. The creature did not move. It just sat there, breathing, watching. I slowly began backing away, keeping my rifle trained on it, moving one careful step at a time. After about 20 feet, I turned and started walking quickly back the way I had come. I glanced over my shoulder every few seconds. The creature was still sitting there, watching me leave. I made it about 100 yards before I heard it moving again. The sound of branches breaking, heavy footsteps, that low, rumbling hum. It was following me, but slowly, maintaining distance. I picked up my pace, not quite running, but moving as fast as I could while still watching my footing on the uneven terrain. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I could hear it behind me, moving through the trees, never getting closer but never falling behind either. This continued for nearly 2 miles. I would walk, it would follow. I would stop, it would stop. It was like being escorted out of its territory, except I was the one deciding the pace, and the thing was just making sure I left. Finally, as I crossed back over the ridge where the trail began, the sounds stopped. I turned around, rifle ready, scanning the tree line. Nothing. The forest was silent again, just wind in the leaves and distant bird calls. I did not stop moving until I reached my truck. I threw my gear in the back, started the engine, and drove straight back to Missouri without looking back. I did not report what I saw. Who would I tell? My colleagues at the Department of Conservation? They would think I had a close encounter with a black bear and panicked. File a report with the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission? They would investigate, find nothing, and dismiss it as a misidentification. I have read enough incident reports to know how these things go. Instead, I did what any scientist would do. I researched. I spent weeks combing through databases, reading field reports, searching for any documented cases of unusual bear sightings in the Ozarks. What I found was disturbing. There have been hundreds of reports over the past century of oversized bears in Arkansas and Missouri. Most are dismissed as exaggeration, hunters overestimating the size of black bears they saw at a distance. But some of the descriptions matched what I saw. Bears with unusually thick fur. Bears that seemed impervious to gunfire. Bears that behaved strangely, sitting down, watching people, following them without aggression. Then I found the folklore. The Ozark howler, the Fook monster, the Gowro. Legends of massive, bear-like creatures roaming the remote hills and hollows of the Ozarks. Most cryptozoologists dismiss these as misidentified black bears or cougars. But what if they were not entirely wrong? What if there is something else out there, something rare enough that most people never see it, but real enough that generations of locals have been reporting it for 200 years? I called my father, who has lived in the Arkansas Ozarks his entire life. He is 73 now, a retired logger who spent 40 years working in the woods around the Boston Mountains. I told him what I saw, described the creature in detail, told him about the rifle shots bouncing off its fur, about the way it followed me without attacking. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then he said, "You saw a big bear." That is what we call them around here. Been seeing them my whole life. Not often, maybe once every 10 years or so. They are not aggressive. They are just big and dumb and slow. Most folks think they are regular black bears that got into something, ate too much, grew too big. But I've seen what you saw. The matted fur, the weird proportions, the way they do not go down when you shoot them. I stopped hunting them decades ago because it felt wrong, like shooting something that was not quite an animal. I asked him what he thought it was. He said he did not know, and he did not want to know. He just knew that deep in the Ozarks, in the places where people do not go, there are things that do not fit into neat categories. Things that have been here longer than we have, and will be here long after we are gone. I have spent 3 months trying to rationalize what I saw. I have considered every logical explanation. An unusually large black bear with a skin condition, a sick or injured bear, behaving abnormally, adrenaline and fear distorting my perception of a normal encounter. But I am a trained wildlife biologist. I know what bears look like. I know how they move, how they react to threats. What I saw was not a bear. Or maybe it was, but it was something more than that. Something that has adapted to survive in ways we do not understand. I have not gone back to the Ozarks. I have not told anyone at work what happened. I have filed this experience away in the part of my brain reserved for things that do not make sense. But I think about it every day. I think about those small, dark eyes watching me with what looked curiosity. I think about the way it sat down, almost polite, as if to say, "You are not in danger, but you need to leave now." There are parts of the natural world we still do not understand. There are species we have not catalogued, behaviors we cannot explain, ecosystems that operate according to rules we have not discovered. The Ozarks are vast, wild, and largely unexplored. It is entirely possible that something exists out there, hidden in the deep hollows and remote ridges, something that has learned to avoid humans, but occasionally crosses paths with us when we venture too far into its territory. I am sharing this because I want people to understand that the wilderness is not a theme park. It is not a controlled environment where every animal has been studied and classified. There are still mysteries out there, still things we do not have names for. And sometimes, if you go far enough off the trail, you might encounter one of them. If you ever go hiking in the Ozarks, and you smell that thick, sulfuric stench, and you hear that low rumbling hum, do not investigate. Do not try to get closer. Just turn around and walk away. Whatever it is, it will let you leave, as long as you respect its space. I survived my encounter because the creature allowed me to. I do not know what would have happened if it had decided I was a threat. I do not want to find out. And I hope you never have to either. The Ozarks are beautiful, ancient, and full of secrets. Some of those secrets are better left undiscovered.